The wedding hall fell completely silent the moment my daughter pointed her finger at me. Wearing her white wedding dress, she looked straight at two security guards and said loudly, "Remove that old man immediately. He is embarrassing me in front of my guests." For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nearly 300 guests turned to stare at me. I stood there holding the small gift box I had planned to give her after the ceremony. One guard slowly walked toward me and spoke politely. "Sir, we have been asked to escort you outside." I looked at my daughter, hoping she would smile and admit it was some terrible joke. She did not. Instead, she folded her arms and looked away as though she had never known me. My future son-in-law remained silent. My relatives lowered their eyes. Not a single person spoke in my defense. I quietly handed the gift box to the guard. "Please give this to the bride after I leave." My daughter immediately shouted, "No, I do not want anything from him." Those words hurt more than anything else that morning. I slowly placed the box on a nearby table and walked toward the exit without arguing. As I reached the doors, I stopped for one brief moment and looked back at the beautiful wedding I had spent nearly 2 years paying for. Every flower, every light, every meal, every decoration had been paid for by me. Yet I was leaving as though I had never belonged there. Just as the doors closed behind me, my phone vibrated. I looked down at the screen. The message was from someone I had not heard from in over 15 years. It contained only 7 words. "Do not leave yet. I am coming." I stood alone in the parking lot with my old coat folded over my arm. Inside the ballroom, the music started again, as though nothing had happened. Guests laughed, glasses clinked together, and the celebration continued without me. I looked at my phone once more. The mysterious message still showed only 7 words. "Do not leave yet. I am coming." There was no name attached to the number. Before I could think about who had sent it, another black luxury car slowly entered the parking lot and stopped directly in front of the entrance. The driver stepped out first and quickly opened the rear door. An elderly gentleman in an expensive navy suit slowly climbed out with the help of a polished wooden cane. Even from a distance, I recognized him immediately. My heart nearly stopped. Richard Collins, the billionaire hotel owner, whom I had not seen in more than 15 years. We had once worked together when I managed one of his struggling hotels. Back then, nobody believed the business could survive. We worked day and night until it became one of the most successful properties in the state. After retiring, I never expected to see him again. Richard looked around until his eyes found me standing alone beside the parking lot. A warm smile appeared on his face. He walked directly toward me and wrapped both arms around my shoulders. "William," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I heard what happened." Before I could answer, the ballroom doors suddenly opened. My daughter stepped outside, clearly annoyed that another guest had arrived late. The moment she recognized Richard Collins, her expression changed completely. She hurried toward him with the biggest smile I had seen all day. "Mr. Collins," she said excitedly. "What an honor. We did not know you were coming." Richard did not even look at her. He kept his eyes on me and quietly asked, "William, is it true they threw you out of the wedding you paid for?" I slowly nodded. Richard's smile disappeared instantly. He turned toward the entrance, looked at the packed ballroom, and spoke one sentence that made everyone freeze. "Then this wedding is about to have a very different ending." Richard Collins walked straight past my daughter without shaking her hand. Every guest near the entrance stopped talking. Even the musicians slowly lowered their instruments as they watched the unexpected scene unfold. My daughter forced another smile. "Mr. Collins, please come inside. We reserved a special table for our VIP guests." Richard calmly looked at her before asking one simple question. "Who paid for this wedding?" She hesitated for a moment. "Well, my father helped." Richard's face hardened. "Helped?" He pointed toward me. "That man paid every dollar for this wedding. Yet you had security throw him out like a stranger." Entire entrance became silent. Guests began whispering to one another. My future son-in-law finally stepped forward. "Sir, this is a private family matter." Richard slowly turned toward him. "No, young man. The moment you publicly humiliated an innocent father in front of hundreds of people, it stopped being private." My daughter folded her arms. "Dad has always tried to control my life. Today is my wedding, and I will decide who stays." I quietly looked at the ground. I had no desire to argue with her on the happiest day of her life. Richard noticed my silence and gently placed a hand on my shoulder. "William, do you still have every receipt?" I looked at him in confusion before nodding. "Yes, I kept copies of every policy payment." Richard smiled for the first time since arriving. "Good." He reached into his coat pocket, took out his phone and made a short call. "Bring the file inside," he said before hanging up. My daughter laughed nervously. "What difference will a few receipts make?" Richard calmly answered, "You are about to find out." Less than 2 minutes later, another black car stopped outside the venue. A woman wearing a business suit stepped out carrying a thick leather briefcase. She walked directly toward Richard and handed him a stack of documents. He opened the folder, looked at the first page, then smiled. "Perfect. Everything is here." Before anyone could ask another question, Richard turned toward the wedding planner and said loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear, "Please stop serving dinner for the next few minutes. There is something every guest deserves to know before this wedding continues." The wedding planner reluctantly lowered the microphone and asked the musicians to stop playing. One by one, conversations faded until the ballroom became completely silent. Nearly 300 guests turned toward Richard Collins as he slowly walked onto the stage. My daughter looked embarrassed. "Mr. Collins, please do not ruin my wedding." Richard calmly replied, "Your wedding was ruined the moment you threw your own father out." He opened the leather folder and held up a stack of documents. "Ladies and gentlemen, before this celebration continues, I believe everyone deserves to know one important fact." He lifted the first receipt into the air. This payment covered the wedding venue. He placed it on the podium. This one paid for the catering. Another receipt followed. This one covered the flowers, then another. The decorations, the photographer, the live band, the honeymoon. Deposit. Every receipt carried only one name at the bottom. William Harper, my name. Guests began whispering louder with each page Richard revealed. My daughter tried to interrupt him. "That does not matter." He chose to help. Richard looked directly at her. "Help?" He held up the final document. "According to these records, your father paid 98% of every wedding expense." The room fell completely silent. Even my future son-in-law looked shocked. Richard slowly closed the folder. "Now I have one question for the bride." He pointed toward me. "If this man embarrassed you so much, why were you willing to let him pay for everything?" My daughter opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her face slowly turned red as hundreds of guests waited for her answer. Just then, an elderly woman stood up from the front row. Everyone recognized her immediately. She was the groom's grandmother, a woman known for never accepting disrespect from anyone. She looked straight at my daughter and quietly said, "Young lady, before you answer Mr. Collins' question, I have one question of my own." She paused for a moment before asking the words that made the entire ballroom hold its breath. "Did you invite your father today because you loved him, or because you still needed his money?" The elderly woman's question echoed through the ballroom. "Did you invite your father because you loved him, or because you still needed his money?" My daughter stood frozen. She looked around the room, hoping someone would rescue her, but every guest waited silently for her answer. Even the groom slowly stepped away from her. After several painful seconds, she finally whispered, "I," but no words followed. Richard Collins quietly closed the folder and stepped back. Sometimes silence tells the truth better than any excuse. The groom looked at my daughter with disappointment. "Emily, is this true?" She quickly shook her head. "No, it is not like that." He pointed toward the receipt still lying on the podium. "Then explain why your father paid for almost everything, but you had him thrown out before the ceremony even ended." Tears began filling her eyes, but the answers never came. At that moment, the wedding planner hurried onto the stage holding a tablet. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "I think everyone should see this." Connected the tablet to the large screen behind the stage. Security camera footage from earlier that morning appeared. Every guest watched as I quietly arrived carrying flowers and a neatly wrapped gift. A few minutes later, the same screen showed my daughter speaking to the head of security. Although there was no audio, everyone could clearly see her pointing directly at me before the guards approached. The planner quietly explained, "Our cameras record video and audio near the entrance." She pressed another button. My daughter's voice echoed through the speakers. "Once the ceremony starts, get him out. I do not want old people ruining my wedding." Photos. A wave of shock swept across the ballroom. Several guests covered their mouths. Others slowly shook their heads in disbelief. My future son-in-law looked at the screen, then back at my daughter. "You told me your father refused to attend the wedding." Emily's face turned completely pale. I can explain." Before she could continue, the groom quietly removed his wedding ring. The room became completely silent as he placed it on the table beside the marriage license. Looking directly into her eyes, he spoke only one sentence. If you can do this to the man who gave you everything, one day you will do the same to me. Then he turned around and walked toward the exit, leaving the entire wedding behind. The groom's footsteps echoed through the ballroom as he walked toward the exit. No one tried to stop him. Emily stood frozen on the stage, tears running down her face. "Please do not leave," she cried. He stopped for only a second without turning around. "You lied to me from the day we got engaged," he said quietly. "If you could publicly humiliate the father who sacrificed everything for you, I no longer know who you really are." Then he walked out. The ballroom doors slowly closed behind him. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. One by one, guests began standing from their tables. Some quietly picked up their coats. Others walked toward me instead of the bride. An elderly couple stopped in front of me first. "Mr. Harper," the husband said softly, "we are deeply sorry for what happened to you." Several more guests shook my hand before leaving. Within 15 minutes, nearly half the ballroom was empty. The celebration my daughter had dreamed about was disappearing before her eyes. Richard Collins quietly looked around the room. "Respect cannot be bought with expensive flowers or beautiful decorations," he said. "It is earned by the way we treat the people who love us most." Emily suddenly ran toward me. Tears covered her face. "Dad, please say something." I looked at her calmly. "What would you like me to say?" She fell to her knees. "I made a terrible mistake." I remained silent. For months she had ignored my phone calls, rejected my advice, and today she had treated me like a stranger in front of hundreds of people. One apology could not erase all of that. Just then my phone rang. I almost ignored it, but Richard quietly nodded for me to answer. The caller introduced himself immediately. "Mr. Harper, this is Jonathan Wells from Harper & Wells Financial." I stepped away from the crowd to hear him better. "I apologize for calling today, but it is urgent." My heart sank. "What happened?" Jonathan spoke carefully. "The investment documents you signed 10 years ago have officially matured this morning." I frowned. I had almost forgotten about those investments. "How much are they worth now?" There was a brief pause. Then Jonathan quietly answered with words that made me stop walking. "Mr. Harper, your portfolio is now valued at just over $28 million. I slowly looked back, toward the nearly empty ballroom. Emily had no idea that, only minutes after throwing me out of the wedding, everything was about to change forever. Jonathan's words echoed in my ears. "Your portfolio is now valued at just over $28 million. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. "28 million? I asked quietly. "Yes, sir," Jonathan replied. "The final paperwork is ready. We only need your signature before the funds are transferred." I thanked him and ended the call without saying another word. Richard Collins looked at me with a small smile. "Good news?" I slowly nodded. "An investment I made years ago has finally matured." Richard did not ask how much it was worth. He simply patted my shoulder. "Your wife always said patience rewards honest people." Before I could answer, Emily hurried toward me again. "Dad, please do not leave like this." Her voice shook with desperation. "I know I hurt you." I quietly looked into her eyes. "Emily, today was not one bad decision. This was a choice you planned long before. Your wedding began." She lowered her head in silence. Just then, one of her bridesmaids rushed over holding a phone. "Emily, your fiancé posted something online." She opened the message for everyone to see. It read, "Today I learned that the way someone treats their parents is the clearest picture of how they will someday treat their spouse. I cannot build a future on disrespect." Within minutes, hundreds of comments began appearing beneath the post. Guests inside the ballroom looked down at their own phones. Several quietly picked up their coats and walked out without saying goodbye. Emily watched everything fall apart in front of her. The dream wedding she had spent 2 years planning was ending in complete humiliation. Richard looked toward the wedding planner. "How many guests are still here?" She checked the seating chart before answering. "Less than 60. Nearly 250 people had already left. Emily suddenly grabbed my hand. "Dad, I will repay every dollar you spent." I gently pulled my hand away. This was never about the money. Tears rolled down her face. "Then what can I do?" I remained silent for a long moment before answering. "One day, when you truly understand what respect means, perhaps we can begin talking again." Just then, Jonathan called once more. "Mr. Harper," he said urgently, "there is one detail I forgot to mention. The investment was placed under very specific conditions written by your late wife." My heart skipped a beat. "What conditions?" Jonathan quietly replied. "Before any money can be released, you must first read the letter your wife left inside the investment file. The ballroom was almost empty by the time I reached my car. Workers had already begun removing flowers while guests quietly drove away. The celebration, that was supposed to become the happiest day of my daughter's life, had ended before the first dance. Richard Collins insisted on driving me to my attorney's office instead of letting me go home alone. "Your wife's letter has waited 10 years, he said softly. "It deserves to be opened today." An hour later, my attorney unlocked a small safety deposit box that had remained sealed since my wife's passing. Inside lay a thick investment file and one white envelope with my name, written in my wife's handwriting. My hands trembled as I carefully opened it. "My dearest William," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means our investment has finally matured. I know you will probably think the money belongs to you, but before you make any decision, I need you to promise me one thing. Never let money become more important than family. Wealth can replace a house, a car, or a business. It can never replace the people we love." Tears slowly rolled down my face. Richard quietly looked away, giving me privacy. I continued reading. "I also know something about our daughter that you may never notice. She is kind at heart, but she is easily influenced by people who admire money more than character. If she ever loses her way, do not rescue her immediately. Let life become her teacher first. Only after she truly changes should you help her." Again, I carefully folded the letter. My wife had written those words nearly 10 years earlier, yet they described today's events almost perfectly. My attorney then opened the investment file. "There is another condition," she said. "Your wife established a family trust." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She smiled gently. "The $28 million legally belongs to you, but your wife instructed that no member of the family can receive a single dollar, unless you personally approve it." Richard quietly laughed. "She trusted your judgment more than anyone else's." Just then, my phone vibrated again. This time it was Emily. I hesitated before answering. Her voice was barely audible. "Dad, everyone is gone. Even the photographers packed up and left. I am sitting alone in my wedding dress." I closed my eyes but remained silent. Then she whispered something that broke my heart. "For the first time today, I finally understand what I really lost." Before I could respond, another voice suddenly interrupted the call. A woman shouted loudly in the background, "Emily! Someone is here asking for your father." Emily sounded confused. "Who?" The answer came through the phone only seconds later. "It is your mother-in-law, and she says she knows a family secret that changes everything." I immediately turned the car around and drove back to the wedding venue with Richard Collins. My heart was racing the entire way. Emily had sounded frightened, not emotional. When we entered the nearly empty ballroom, only a handful of workers remained cleaning the tables. Emily was standing near the stage, still wearing her wedding dress. Beside her stood the groom's mother, Margaret. She looked calm but serious. The moment she saw me, she slowly walked forward. "Mr. Harper," she said quietly, "there is something my late husband asked me to tell you if this wedding ever fell apart." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Margaret reached into her handbag and carefully removed a sealed envelope. Across the front were the words, "For William Harper only." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from the groom's late father, a man I had known years ago. "William," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my son has discovered the truth about Emily before it was too late. Years ago, while working in the banking industry, I uncovered a man who quietly manipulated wealthy families by encouraging children to turn against their parents. His goal was always the same: isolate the parent, gain control of their money, and disappear." I looked up in confusion. "Who was he?" Margaret slowly answered before I could continue reading. "His name was Victor Mason." Richard Collins' expression changed instantly. "Victor Mason?" he whispered. "I know that name," Margaret nodded. "Most people never heard of him because he never used his real identity twice." I looked back at the letter. "Your daughter met him almost 3 years ago through a financial seminar. My investigators believed he had been influencing her decisions ever since. Before I could gather enough evidence, I became ill." Emily suddenly burst into tears. "Dad, I remember him." Everyone turned toward her. "He kept telling me that parents only hold their children back, that successful people cut emotional ties, that money should always come before family." She covered her face with both hands. "I believed every word." Richard quietly asked, "Where is this Victor Mason now?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "Nobody knows." Just then, one of the security guards hurried into the ballroom carrying a small business card. "Excuse me," he said. A man left this at the front desk 10 minutes ago. He said Mr. Harper would understand. I took the card. There was no name. Only one sentence printed in black ink. This was only the beginning. On the back was a phone number, and underneath it, written by hand, were 3 chilling words. Call me tomorrow. The business card stayed in my hand long after everyone stopped talking. Only 4 words echoed through my mind. This was only the beginning. Richard. Collins quietly looked at the phone number printed on the back. Do not call it yet, he warned. If this person wants your attention, we first need to know who we are dealing with. My attorney immediately contacted a private investigator she had trusted for years. Within 30 minutes, he arrived carrying advanced tracing equipment. He carefully examined the number before shaking his head. It was activated only yesterday using fake identification. Emily looked frightened. Then whoever sent it planned this. The investigator nodded. Long before the wedding. Just then my phone rang. The screen displayed the same number from the business card. Everyone in the room froze. Richard quietly pressed the speaker button before handing me the phone. I answered without saying a word. For several seconds there was only silence. Then an older man's calm voice finally spoke. Mr. Harper, congratulations. You passed the first test. My heart began pounding. Who are you? The man ignored the question. Most fathers would have chosen revenge today. You did not. Richard stepped closer. Tell us your name. The caller softly laughed. Names do not matter. Choices do. I tightened my grip on the phone. What do you want? The man's voice became serious. 25 years ago, someone saved my life when everyone else walked away. That man was you, I frowned. I could not remember ever meeting him. He continued. I have spent years watching the lives of people you once helped. Every one of them remembers your kindness. Richard looked at me with surprise. The stranger continued speaking. Your daughter almost destroyed everything you built. I wanted to know whether your heart had changed after all these years. I quietly asked why. There was another long silence before he answered. Because I am responsible for something. Your wife never told you. My breathing became heavier. What are you talking about? The man sighed. Before she passed away, your wife asked me to protect one final secret until the day your family truly needed it. Every person in the room stared at the phone. Then the caller spoke one sentence that made my knees feel weak. Mr. Harper, your wife left behind something far more valuable than $28 million. And only you can claim it. Before I could ask another question, the line suddenly went dead. The room remained silent after the call ended. No one moved. Richard Collins slowly took the phone from my hand and looked at the disconnected screen. He wanted us to hear every word, he said quietly. My attorney nodded, which means he will contact us again. Before anyone could speak, the private investigator's laptop suddenly made a loud notification sound. I traced the signal, he announced. The call did not come from another state. It came from less than 5 miles away. Richard frowned. Can you pinpoint the location? The investigator zoomed in on the map. My heart nearly stopped when I recognized the address. It was my late wife's favorite library. For over 30 years, she had volunteered there every Saturday morning. We drove there immediately. The old building was almost empty except for one elderly librarian quietly arranging books on a shelf. The moment she saw me, she smiled gently. Mr. Harper, I have been expecting you. I looked at her in confusion. You know who called me? She slowly nodded. Without saying another word, she reached beneath the front desk and placed a small wooden key on the counter. Attached to it was a faded tag with my wife's handwriting. It simply read, Shelf 47. I walked through the quiet library until I reached the old history section. Hidden behind several books was a tiny locked compartment that I had never noticed before. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. Inside was a leather journal, a sealed envelope, and a small velvet pouch. I carefully opened the envelope first. It was another letter from my wife. William, she wrote, if you are reading this, then our daughter has finally learned that love cannot survive without respect. Only now is it time for you to know the truth. I protected for many years. My heart began racing. I continued reading. Inside the journal is the story of our family's greatest sacrifice, a secret that has been hidden for more than 40 years. Richard quietly asked, What is in the velvet pouch? I slowly untied it. A single old key fell into my hand. My attorney frowned. What does it open? Before anyone could guess, the elderly librarian quietly spoke from behind us. Not what, where. Every one of us turned toward her. She smiled gently before saying the words my wife had apparently trusted her to keep for decades. That key opens a place your wife visited every year without telling anyone. Because she promised someone she would protect it until you were ready. The elderly librarian slowly walked toward the old wooden staircase at the back of the building. "Please follow me," she said softly. Richard, my attorney, and I exchanged confused glances before following her downstairs into a small archive room that had been closed to the public for decades. She stopped in front of an old steel door. There was only one keyhole. "Use the key your wife left you," she whispered. My hands trembled as I inserted the small brass key. With a quiet click, the heavy door slowly opened. Inside was a tiny room containing only a wooden desk, several photo albums, and a large metal safe. On top of the safe rested another handwritten letter in my wife's unmistakable handwriting. "William," it began, "if this room has finally been opened, then our family has survived its darkest day." I slowly unfolded the pages. 42 years ago, before we were married, an elderly widow named Eleanor saved my life after a terrible car accident. She had no children and no family. Before she passed away, she asked me to make one promise: protect the small foundation she created to quietly help abandoned seniors who had nowhere else to go. My eyes filled with tears. I had never heard Eleanor's name before. My wife had carried this promise alone for decades. The letter continued. "Every year I secretly donated money to keep the foundation alive because I never wanted recognition. I wanted kindness to remain anonymous." Richard quietly looked around the room. "Your wife built all of this without telling anyone." I nodded silently. Then I opened the metal safe. Inside were carefully organized financial records, photographs of hundreds of elderly people who had received help, and one official document bearing the foundation's seal. My attorney carefully examined it before looking at me with complete disbelief. "William," she whispered, "according to these papers, you are now the legal chairman of the Harper Eleanor Foundation." I frowned. "What does that mean?" She smiled warmly. "It means your wife quietly built one of the largest privately funded charities for abandoned seniors in the state." Richard looked at me proudly. "Your greatest inheritance was never money." Before I could answer, the elderly librarian gently placed one final envelope into my hands. "Your wife instructed me to give you this only after you discovered the foundation." I slowly opened it. Inside was a single photograph of my wife standing beside dozens of smiling elderly men and women outside a beautiful retirement home. Written beneath the picture were 8 simple words: "Promise me they will never feel abandoned again." I looked up, unable to speak. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated once more. The mysterious caller had sent only one text message. "Now you finally know why she chose you." I stared at the message on my phone for several seconds. "Now you finally know why she chose you." Before I could reply, the number disappeared. When I tried calling back, it no longer existed. Richard quietly smiled. "Some people enter our lives only to finish a promise." I slipped the phone into my pocket and looked around the foundation archive once more. Every photograph on the walls showed elderly men and women smiling beside my wife. Some were holding birthday cakes. Others were receiving house keys, winter coats, or medical equipment. She had quietly changed hundreds of lives without ever telling me. My attorney suddenly noticed another locked cabinet hidden behind the safe. "William, there is something else." Using the same brass key, I opened the cabinet. Inside were dozens of thank you letters from seniors whose lives had been saved by the foundation. One letter immediately caught my attention because it carried no signature. It simply read, "To the woman who saved my life, one day I will repay your kindness by protecting the man you love most." My heart skipped a beat. Richard looked over my shoulder. "That handwriting—" Before he could finish, the elderly librarian quietly nodded. "Yes," she smiled gently. "The anonymous caller." I looked at her in surprise. "You know who he is?" She slowly shook her head. "No, your wife never told me his name. She only said he was once a broken man who had lost everything until the foundation gave him hope." Just then, the front door of the library opened. An elderly man wearing a simple gray coat slowly walked inside, carrying a bouquet of white roses. Without saying a word, he walked to a small photograph of my wife hanging on the wall and carefully placed the flowers beneath it. He turned toward me with tears in his eyes. "Your wife saved my life 27 years ago," he said softly. "When everyone else ignored me, she gave me food, a place to sleep, and the courage to begin again." My eyes filled with tears. "Were you the one who called me?" The old man smiled kindly but never answered the question. Instead, he handed me a small envelope. She asked me to give you this, only after you discovered the foundation. Inside was one final handwritten note from my wife. William, if you are holding this letter, then you have already discovered the greatest truth of my life. Money disappears. Fame fades. Even pain eventually heals. But one act of kindness can live inside another person's heart forever. Promise me you will keep this foundation alive, because somewhere tonight, another lonely father is praying that someone still cares. I slowly folded the letter against my heart. For the first time since the wedding, I truly understood what my wife had left behind. It was never wealth. It was a legacy of compassion that would continue long after both of us were gone. The following Saturday morning, I stood outside the Harper Eleanor Foundation for the first time as its new chairman. The building looked modest from the outside, but inside, it was filled with warmth, laughter, and hope. Elderly men and women greeted one another like family. Volunteers served breakfast with smiles, and no one seemed to care about wealth or status. They only cared that someone remembered them. As I walked through the halls, dozens of residents stopped to shake my hand. One elderly woman smiled through tears and said, "Your wife never let us feel forgotten." Another quietly added, "She used to tell us that her husband had the kindest heart she had ever known." Hearing those words nearly broke me. I had spent years believing I knew everything about my wife, yet every day I discovered another beautiful chapter of her life. Richard Collins looked around the room and smiled. "William, this is the greatest investment either of you ever made." I nodded quietly, and I almost lost sight of it, because I was focused on everything I had lost. Later, that afternoon, Emily arrived at the foundation without warning. She was no longer wearing expensive clothes or jewelry. She simply carried a box of donated blankets in her arms. She walked slowly toward me before placing the box on the floor. "Dad," she whispered, "I know I cannot erase what I did, but if you will allow me, I want to volunteer here." I looked into her eyes. For the first time in many years, I did not see pride. I saw genuine regret. I remained silent for a long moment before finally answering. "You are not here because you are my daughter." She lowered her head. "I understand," I continued. "You are here because these people deserve kindness. If you are willing to serve them with your whole heart, then you are welcome to stay." Tears filled her eyes as she quietly nodded. Over the following weeks, she returned every day. She cleaned dining tables, served meals, folded laundry, and spent hours listening to lonely seniors tell stories about their lives. She never asked anyone to forgive her. She simply worked. One evening, an elderly resident gently took her hand and smiled. "Young lady, your father raised a good woman. She just lost her way for a little while." Emily quietly wiped away her tears. Across the room, I watched everything without saying a word. My wife had been right. Some lessons could never be taught with money. They could only be learned through humility, patience, and service. As I looked around the foundation she had built in secret, I realized that her greatest gift had never been hidden inside a safe or an investment account. It had been hidden inside the lives she changed, and now perhaps inside the heart of our daughter as well. A month later, the Harper Eleanor Foundation held its annual community dinner. Unlike the lavish wedding that had ended in heartbreak, this event was simple. There were no expensive decorations, no luxury chandeliers, and no photographers competing for attention. Yet the room was filled with genuine smiles. More than 200 elderly men and women sat together like one large family. Emily worked quietly in the kitchen from early morning until the last meal was served. She never mentioned who she was. Most of the residents simply knew her as the young volunteer who never stopped helping. As the evening came to an end, Richard Collins stepped onto the small stage and adjusted the microphone. "Tonight," he announced, "we would like to recognize someone whose life has completely changed over the past few months." Emily looked up in surprise. Richard smiled warmly. "This young woman arrived here carrying guilt. She stayed because she found purpose." The audience applauded as Emily slowly walked onto the stage with tears already forming in her eyes. Richard handed her a framed certificate recognizing her hundreds of volunteer hours. Before she could return to her seat, one elderly resident slowly stood with the help of his walker. "Young lady," he said softly, "I have one request." Emily nodded. "Anything," the old man smiled. "Would you hug your father?" The room became completely silent. Emily turned toward me. Tears streamed down her face as she slowly walked across the room. She stopped only inches away and whispered, "Dad, I know I cannot change the past, but thank you for giving me the chance to become someone Mom would be proud of." Without saying a word, I opened my arms. She broke down crying as she hugged me tighter than she ever had before. Around us, the entire room stood and applauded. Richard quietly wiped away a tear before smiling. "That," he whispered, "is what healing looks like." At that exact moment, one of the Foundation employees hurried inside carrying a large envelope marked, "Personal, William Harper." I frowned. "Who sent it?" The employee shook his head. There was no return address. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single newspaper clipping from 30 years earlier. The headline made my hands begin to shake. "Local factory fire claims 3 lives. One unknown hero saves 27 workers." Underneath the article, someone had circled one sentence in red ink. "The hero refused to reveal his name." On the back of the clipping were 6 handwritten words. "Your wife knew the truth all along." The newspaper clipping stayed in my hands long after everyone else had left the hall. "The hero refused to reveal his name." I read the sentence again and again. Emily quietly looked at me. "Dad, was that you?" I slowly nodded. 30 years ago, the factory where I worked caught fire. I managed to get 27 people out before the roof collapsed. Richard Collins looked stunned. "William, you never told anyone." I smiled faintly. There was nothing to tell. I simply did what anyone should have done. My attorney carefully turned the clipping over. Beneath the handwritten message was another line I had not noticed before. "Open the red file inside your wife's desk." My heart skipped a beat. We drove home immediately. My late wife's study had remained untouched since the day she passed away. I slowly opened the old wooden desk and searched every drawer until I found a thin red file hidden beneath several journals. Inside were newspaper articles, photographs from the factory fire, and one sealed envelope addressed to me. My hands trembled as I opened it. "William," my wife had written, "for 30 years you believed nobody knew what you did that day. But I knew. I met one of the workers you rescued before we were married." He told me the entire story. That was the day I realized I wanted to spend my life with a man who risked everything for complete strangers without asking for recognition. Tears rolled down my face. She continued. "The world called the hero unknown. I knew his name from the very beginning." Emily quietly covered her mouth as she listened. "Dad, you never even told your own family." I smiled gently. "Heroes do not need applause. Saving lives was reward enough." Richard slowly shook his head. "Now I understand why your wife trusted you with the Foundation." Just then, another photograph slipped from the file onto the floor. It showed me standing outside the burning factory beside a young firefighter. On the back of the photograph, my wife had written only one sentence. "One of the people you saved that day will return when your family needs him most." Everyone looked at each other in confusion. Before anyone could speak, the front doorbell suddenly rang. I walked to the entrance and opened the door. Standing on my porch was an elderly man wearing a retired firefighter's uniform. He smiled warmly before quietly saying, "Mr. Harper, 30 years ago you carried me out of that burning building. Today it is my turn to repay the debt I have owed you ever since." The retired firefighter slowly stepped inside my home, carrying a worn leather folder that looked almost as old as the factory fire itself. Emily quietly offered him a chair, but he remained standing. "Mr. Harper," he said, "for 30 years I have waited for the right time to give you this." He carefully placed the folder on the table. Inside were faded newspaper articles, photographs from the fire, and dozens of handwritten witness statements. My attorney slowly flipped through the pages before looking at me in disbelief. "William, this is enough evidence to officially identify you as the man who saved 27 lives." I quietly shook my head. "That was never important to me." The firefighter smiled warmly. "It was important to the families who never had the chance to thank you." He reached into his pocket and removed a small silver badge. Every survivor from that day contributed to have this made. The badge was engraved with only 4 words: "Our hero, our family." Tears filled my eyes as I accepted it. The firefighter continued, "There is one more thing." He handed me another envelope. This one contained 27 letters, each written by a different survivor or a member of their family. One father thanked me for saving the daughter he almost lost. Another woman wrote that because I carried her husband out of the factory, their children had grown up with a father. One letter simply read, "Every birthday I celebrate exists because of you." Emily quietly wiped away her tears. "Dad, I spent so much time believing success came from money and appearances. I never realized the richest person in our family was you." I gently smiled. Real wealth has never been measured by what we keep. It is measured by what we give. Richard Collins looked around the room before speaking. William, tomorrow I am announcing a major donation to the Harper Eleanor Foundation. I immediately shook my head. Only if it helps more families. Not to honor me. Richard laughed softly. That is exactly why you deserve it. Before leaving, the retired firefighter paused at the front door. There is one final surprise waiting for you tomorrow morning, he said with a smile. 27 people have traveled here. Every one of them wants to meet the man who changed their lives. As the door quietly closed behind him, I looked toward the photograph of my late wife hanging on the wall. For the first time, I understood why she had hidden so many secrets. She never wanted the world to admire us. She only wanted the people we helped to have another chance at life. Tomorrow, I would finally meet the people whose lives had become part of our family's legacy. The next morning, 27 people stood outside the Harper Eleanor Foundation waiting for me. Some were elderly. Some were young adults who had only heard stories about the factory fire from their parents. One by one, they stepped forward, shook my hand, and thanked me for a decision I had made 30 years earlier without expecting anything in return. One woman hugged me tightly before whispering, "Because you saved my father. I grew up with the man who taught me how to ride a bicycle." Another man smiled through tears. "Because you carried my mother out of that factory. She lived long enough to meet her grandchildren." I could not find the words to answer them. I simply stood there, overwhelmed by the lives that had quietly grown from one act of courage. Richard Collins announced a major expansion of the Harper Eleanor Foundation, so that no elderly person in the community would ever be left alone or forgotten. Emily became one of the foundation's full-time volunteers, never asking for recognition and never expecting forgiveness. She earned trust again through years of quiet service, just as her mother had hoped she would. As the ceremony ended, I walked to my wife's photograph displayed in the entrance hall. I gently placed the silver badge beneath it and smiled. "You were right," I whispered. "Kindness never truly disappears. It simply keeps living through the people whose lives it touches." Before leaving, my youngest granddaughter slipped her small hand into mine and asked, "Grandpa, what is the greatest gift you ever received?" I looked around at my family, the foundation, and the people whose lives had become forever connected to ours. Then I smiled and answered, "It was never money, property, or recognition. The greatest gift was discovering that a single act of love can echo through generations, changing lives long after we are gone." As we walked home together, I realized my daughter's wedding had not destroyed our family after all. It had uncovered the truth, restored what mattered most, and revealed the legacy my wife had quietly built with love, humility, and compassion. Sometimes life breaks your heart, not to end your story, but to reveal the purpose you were meant to leave behind. The end.